Here's the uncomfortable truth. Deep down, your brain often treats future you as more distant than present you. Researchers found that when people imagine their future self, brain scans show patterns similar to when they think about strangers. No wonder tomorrow's version of you always seems like someone else's problem. But what if those broken promises aren't laziness? In this video, we'll look at tools like microexperiments, environment design, shadow integration, and accountability that work with your brain instead of against it. For now, grab a pen and notebook. Hold them for 10 seconds. You'll need them for a quick experiment later. Your brain thinks future you is basically a stranger. Think about the last time you promised yourself you'd finally break a habit or start something new. Maybe it was setting the alarm an hour earlier, or deciding you'd write every day, or telling yourself you'd actually fold the laundry tonight. In the moment, you meant it. But when the time came, it felt like a completely different person had made the deal, leaving you to carry out something you no longer cared about. That isn't just laziness. It ties back to how your brain perceives the link between present you and future you. Researchers at Stanford ran experiments where people inside brain scanners were asked to imagine themselves years into the future. What they found was striking. Activity in regions like the medial prefrontal cortex shifted when people thought about their future selves. Those signals resembled patterns the brain often shows when imagining strangers, not when reflecting on one's current self. In other words, some parts of your brain treat future you as an other, not identical to you, but categorically distant and outside the present self. This difference helps explain why lofty commitments collapse so easily. Your brain draws a subtle boundary. The present you making the promise feels real and immediate, while the imagined future you is processed in ways that resemble how you think about unrelated people. That creates distance, and distance erodes responsibility. If you don't feel the exhaustion or deadlines future you will face, then skipping actions now feels almost reasonable. Why stress today for someone your brain doesn't fully register as you? This perspective reframes why delayed goals feel so slippery. It's less about having no willpower and more about having a perceptual gap. Psychologists call this self-continuity, the degree to which you feel connected to your future identity. When that connection weakens, your brain quietly assigns the work, the discomfort, and the payoff to a stranger you might never really meet. And here's the everyday cost of that gap. You said you de-exercise, but decided to stay comfortable on the couch. That soreness isn't yours, it's theirs. You told yourself you de-finish the email tonight, but you chose Netflix because someone else, future you, can deal with the tedium. Seen through this lens, procrastination isn't moral failure, it's a form of outsourcing. Your brain protects your current comfort by delegating consequences to the version of you it feels least connected to. Once you see it this way, the guilt starts to soften. Because those broken promises aren't just weak discipline. They're the result of how the brain organizes identity across time. If your future self is poorly integrated into your sense of me, willpower alone won't fix the tug-of-war. That's why attempts to brute force change collapse so predictably. You can summon motivation for a day or two, but the moment stress or fatigue hits, your brain defaults to preserving present you and deferring costs onto the stranger future. Here's the encouraging part: you can shorten that distance. The brain is plastic, it responds to cues and context. One simple exercise supported by research is the future self letter. The step is straightforward. Write one short paragraph from the perspective of yourself 5 years down the line. Imagine future you talking directly to present you. Then, read it aloud to yourself. This small act gives the brain a more concrete, personal image of future you, making them feel less like an abstract stranger and more like a conversational partner. Over time, that strengthens the sense of continuity and measurably increases follow-through on long-term goals. Notice what's happening here. It's not about punishing yourself for failing or endlessly demanding more grit. It's about redesigning how you frame identity across time. Grit is like a push of applause in your head. It's loud but temporary. Continuity creates alignment, which is far more stable. By updating how you perceive future you reduce the need to fight yourself in the first place. That's why this realization matters. Once you understand that your struggles aren't evidence of laziness or lack of character, you can stop trying to cure them with shame. The problem isn't who you are, It's how the brain has carved a line between your present and future identity. And design, not discipline, is the way forward. If you close that identity gap, using tools like letters, environment shifts, or visualizations, you stop treating your life like someone else's responsibility. So the next time you see yourself falter on a plan, pause. Ask if you're really failing or if you're feeling the effects of that invisible gap. When you stop blaming your personality and start addressing the psychological distance, the path changes. You're no longer chasing after bursts of motivation. You're building connection that pulls you forward even when desire fizzles out. Which raises another crucial question. If identity distance explains why we procrastinate, why do quick bursts of enthusiasm still fade so fast? We've all felt it. The buzz of a new system or hack that dies in days. Understanding why that surge disappears is the next step in breaking this cycle. Why motivation disappears faster than your phone battery? Why do those promising new routines or hacks lose their shine so quickly? You start a system, and for the first couple of days, it feels like you've unlocked a secret reserve of energy. You're up earlier, focused longer, and convinced this is finally the one that will stick. Then, almost overnight, that excitement slips away. The habit feels heavier, the spark is missing, and by the end of the week, you're back where you started. The issue isn't that you're incapable or that the hack was worthless. The issue is how motivation works in the brain. Most people imagine motivation as a steady supply of fuel, something you collect and then burn across long stretches of effort. But what scientists observe tells a different story. Motivation often works in short bursts, driven by neural reward signals in dopamine pathways and networks that highlight what feels important in the moment. Novelty, in particular, tends to amplify those bursts. That's why the start of a new habit feels electric. Your brain is tuned to reward newness with energy. But as repetition dulls novelty, those reward signals fade. The routine now feels flat, not because you're broken, but because the surge served its evolutionary purpose and switched off. Seen clearly, this makes disappointing patterns easier to understand. Signing up for an online course, buying a new planner, or sketching out an ambitious schedule lights up your brain with possibility. The energy comes from imagining change itself, not from slogging through the real work day after day. When your brain adjusts to the routine, the novelty and its motivational spark diminishes naturally. This loop isn't failure. It's a predictable blend of reward signals and habituation. The problem is expectation. During those early days, the rush convinces you that motivation should remain constant. So when it fades, you turn it inward, blaming yourself for not holding the same intensity. But the reality is that your brain was never designed to keep generating that level of push. Across human history, novelty was rewarded because it signaled survival, finding new food, tools, or landscapes. Familiarity, in contrast, rarely gave the brain a surge. That's why staying committed to a repeating pattern often feels harder than starting it. You're not stubborn or flawed for losing steam, you're wired that way. This wiring becomes dangerous when people build their whole productivity strategy on daily motivation. They expect each morning to deliver that fresh surge, as if raw drive could be summoned on demand. But depending on motivation to sustain action is like depending on fireworks to light a room every night. Motivational bursts are dazzling and powerful, but temporary by nature. Without something else in place, the dark inevitably returns. So what does work? Systems that keep going when motivation doesn't. Think of an airplane. The engines need thrust to take off, but once it reaches altitude, the plane can cruise with far less effort. Motivation can play the role of thrust. It helps you launch. But once you're airborne, you need habits and environments structured to carry you forward. Here's where the shift happens. Productivity isn't about creating more hype, it's about reducing friction. Every behavior has some level of effort attached to it. If that barrier is high, even the strongest motivational pep talk won't sustain action for long. But if the barrier is low, you almost slide into the behavior without needing to negotiate with yourself. Friction, not willpower, is usually the deciding factor. A classic example is exercise. If your sneakers are buried in a closet, each workout requires an extra decision and action before you even start. But if your shoes are waiting by the door, the entry barrier is smaller. You've stripped away some resistance, which means even when your motivation dips, the action remains within easy reach. These small environmental shifts seem trivial, but over time they outperform the energy spikes you keep expecting motivation to provide. One effective strategy the research supports is starting with tiny habits, micro behaviors tied to routines you already do automatically. Instead of building a system that depends on grand energy, you anchor new actions to stable cues. For example, pouring your morning coffee can trigger a 2-minute stretch or a few sentences in your notebook. The scale is deliberately small so that it feels manageable even at low motivation. By stacking new behaviors onto existing habits, you train your brain to treat them as automatic extensions rather than monumental challenges. Notice what this does. It focuses less on maintaining the emotional high of motivation and more on designing a structure that will gently carry you along. You don't need to feel inspired or driven every day to make progress, because your environment and routines quietly remove the hardest part, the starting line. And each time you repeat that small action, you reinforce an identity, not someone waiting for inspiration, but someone who simply acts. Think about moments when you've relied solely on motivation. The first few attempts feel effortless, like writing every day for 3 days in a row because the initial thrill carried you. Then, by day 4, your energy vanishes. This drop doesn't mean you're unsuited to writing. It means the system you built depended on a resource that was never stable. Imagine instead that you'd placed a notebook on your desk each night with a reminder to write 1 sentence after sitting down the next morning. Even if you lacked a motivational surge, the setup itself nudged you into action. Most days, 1 sentence grows into more. Over time, the act becomes less about waiting for energy and more about being the kind of person who writes. The critical shift is in the questions you ask. Instead of wondering, how do I keep myself fired up every day? Ask, how do I make this action so frictionless I'll do it even when my energy is low? That pivot transforms the way progress feels. It removes the judgment of not being motivated enough and replaces it with choices you can actually control. Setting cues, lowering barriers, and designing supportive environments doesn't feel as glamorous as chasing motivational highs, but it produces steady movement. This also explains why chasing endless sources of hype rarely works. The internet is packed with motivational speeches, viral challenges, and stories designed to give you a jolt. And yes, they work briefly. But just like adrenaline, constant exposure exhausts you. You come down from the high, and if you've built no systems beneath it, you crash. Systems don't care how excited you feel that morning. They continue to operate whether or not emotions line up, and that consistency is what creates lasting results. So the next time you find yourself frustrated that a habit collapsed after just a few days, remember, motivation isn't a defect, it's a spark. It's designed to get you started, not to carry you endlessly forward. Sustainable progress comes from designing structures that keep you moving when that spark burns low. Reducing resistance and anchoring new behaviors to what's already automatic turns discipline into design. Productivity doesn't need to be something you fight for. When the resistance is low, it feels almost natural. And this points to something deeper, because once you understand that motivation is temporary and systems are what sustain you, it changes how you interpret the struggles you feel in moments of growth. When the old boost of inspiration dies off, you may also notice another voice creeping in, the uneasy sense that you don't actually belong in the work you've chosen, that you're somehow faking it. But that feeling has a surprising role to play in growth itself. The gift hidden inside imposter syndrome. What if the uneasy sense of not belonging wasn't a flaw at all, but a clue? This is the hidden message inside imposter syndrome, the uncomfortable belief that you're unqualified, undeserving, or simply faking it when stepping into new spaces. It feels like a warning sign that you should retreat, but often it's a signal of growth. Researchers describe this as an identity gap, the space between who you've been and who you're becoming. That gap unsettles you, but at the same time, it points straight at the places where you're leveling up. Notice when imposter thoughts appear. They rarely show up in familiar routines. You don't wake up questioning your ability to make toast or wondering if you deserve to reply to text. Those things feel safe because you've built a track record with them. The voice of fraudulence surfaces when you accept a promotion, speak up in unfamiliar meetings, or present ideas in front of a new audience. These are boundary-crossing moments where old evidence can't reassure you yet. It's not that you're failing, it's that your identity hasn't caught up with your new reality. the intensity of imposter syndrome often mirrors the significance of the leap. The bigger the responsibility, audience, or visibility, the louder the voice insisting you don't belong. That can be confusing. People assume strong self-doubt proves inadequacy, when in reality it often reflects the scale of growth they're undergoing. Think of it as a system alert, like an update reminder flashing at the edge of consciousness, signaling that old settings can't quite run the new program. In that sense, imposter feelings are less like malfunctions and more like prompts to expand capacity. This pattern is widely observed. For instance, studies of medical students show imposter thoughts spike most when they transition into demanding new environments. Those same students weren't less capable. They were simply exposed to more responsibility, and the mental strain revealed the gap between their old identity and their new role. Importantly, those studies also confirm that imposter experiences often correlate with stress, exhaustion, and risk of burnout if left unchecked. So the message here isn't to romanticize the fraud feeling. It isn't automatically a badge of honor. It's often an indicator of growth, but it can also weigh heavily on mental health if it isn't managed. That nuance matters. Confidence and competence are easy to confuse. Many of us grew up assuming certainty means capability, while doubt means you're out of your depth. But imposter syndrome flips that. The doubt only appears when you're stretching, when the old shell of identity doesn't quite fit the new role. It's a temporary mismatch, not definitive evidence that you don't belong. Think of it less like a verdict and more like a growth pain. Picture someone starting their first professional job. On paper, they've been hired for their abilities. On the first day, though, they feel paralyzed by thoughts of not being ready. Every question in a meeting feels like an exposure test. Every task feels like proof they're unqualified. Yet when you zoom out, what actually triggered those feelings wasn't failure. It was the step into uncharted territory. The brain defaults to uncertainty when identity hasn't yet stabilized. Those fears reflect the gap, not the reality of their ability. It helps to look at it through another daily lens, speaking up in meetings. Maybe at smaller gatherings you felt fine, but the first time you share input in front of senior colleagues, imposter syndrome strikes. Your heart races, you assume others are silently criticizing, and every minor stumble echoes in your head. But again, the trigger wasn't incompetence, it was the expansion of your role. If you map your imposter moments like this, patterns emerge. They cluster around every stretch forward. Reframing imposter syndrome as identity expansion changes the story. Instead of treating the fraud feeling as a stop sign, you can treat it as a marker. The signal reads, "You're occupying ground you haven't stood on before." In many ways, imposter syndrome is evidence of change happening in real time. Like the soreness after exercise, it doesn't feel good, but it reflects adaptation in progress. Without that tension, you'd probably still be standing where you were before. That's the gift hidden in the struggle. Imposter syndrome creates an immediate feedback loop. You don't need months to confirm growth. You feel it each time your brain delivers that nervous protest. While it can be uncomfortable, it is also a rapid signal that progress is underway. External achievements take time to materialize. Imposter moments appear instantly at each boundary crossed. Still, seeing imposter syndrome as a growth signal doesn't mean ignoring its toll. Left unaddressed, the stress can snowball into chronic anxiety, isolation, or burnout. One practical way to counter this, supported by research, is mindfulness. Pausing for even 2 minutes of breath-based grounding can interrupt the spiral and create enough distance to reappraise the thought. The statement, "I don't belong here," can be reframed as "I am adjusting to a new level." You can even experiment with this in the moment. When imposter thoughts surface, close your eyes, focus on one slow inhale and exhale, and notice the shift. Try it, and if you want, share how it works for you in the comments. Another tactic is to track your imposter episodes instead of hiding them. Write them down. When they appear, what triggered them and what the context was. Over a few weeks, you'll likely see a log of growth events, presentations, bigger responsibilities, difficult conversations. The supposed fraudulent moments become visible markers of advancement. When you see them strung together, they no longer look like proof of inadequacy. They read like a record of transformation. This reframing doesn't erase discomfort, but it gives it purpose. Instead of spiraling in shame, you can interpret imposter syndrome as identity lag, a normal delay between action and self-concept. The voice may still whisper that you're a fraud, but recognizing its role reduces its power. You're not trying to eliminate the feeling. You're learning to see through it. So the real question becomes, when that voice shows up, will you let it dictate retreat, or will you recognize it as part of the passage into new ground? Most of the time, the answer isn't about eradicating doubt. It's about walking forward while doubt tags along. That shift is what allows the fear of fraudulence to coexist with the truth of growth. If you can do that, hold the discomfort and still move, you gain a kind of compass. The places where imposter syndrome hits hardest are usually the precise places where your future identity is being constructed. Rather than a reason to back down, it's a signal pointing to expansion in real time. That leads directly into another overlooked source of personal growth: the aspects of yourself you usually try to push away. Because while imposter syndrome maps your progress on the outside, there are parts of your inner self, often hidden or disowned, that can quietly drain your growth if you don't address them. And understanding that hidden side is the next step. Your shadow is stealing your productivity points. What if the traits you've buried because they feel unacceptable are the very ones draining your energy every day? Here's where psychological research gives us a useful concept. Carl Jung described something called the shadow, traits or drives we repress because they don't fit the image we want to show the world. These don't disappear. They keep operating beneath the surface, and the more we try to deny them, the more they shape our behavior indirectly. In other words, your shadow is not just hiding parts of you, it's stealing productivity points without you realizing it. Think of competitiveness, envy, ambition, or even blunt honesty. Most people learn to suppress these because they sound unflattering, but burying them doesn't neutralize them. It's like shoving a beach ball underwater. You can keep it down for a while, but sooner or later, the pressure makes it surge back up in unpredictable ways. And this is exactly what happens when we repress drives. The ambition you refuse to admit might come out as endless procrastination. The competitiveness you avoid acknowledging could show up as resentment toward others. The envy you hide could resurface as bitterness or burnout. The energy doesn't vanish. It leaks sideways in ways that cost you time, focus, and momentum. One of the biggest productivity drains is the sheer effort required to keep those traits hidden. Think about how exhausting it is to constantly monitor yourself, pushing down impulses that don't match your ideal image. That energy could be fueling your work, but instead it's tied up in repression. Which is why some of the most powerful breakthroughs come not from ignoring your shadow, but from integrating it. By recognizing and redirecting those drives instead of fighting them, you reclaim energy that otherwise stays locked away. Let's look at ambition. In many contexts, ambition gets framed as arrogance or selfishness, something polite people downplay. But ambition itself is just energy pointing forward. It's persistence when novelty fades, fuel when comfort tempts you to stop. If you strip it away, you don't get humility, you get stuck. You stall not because you lack discipline, but because the inner engine that wants progress has been shut off. Or take competitiveness. Left unacknowledged, it twists into bitterness and comparison. But when redirected, it sharpens focus. It sets higher standards, helping you dig deeper and produce better. It doesn't have to mean rivalry with others. It can simply be you raising the bar against your past work. Without it, you risk plateauing while pretending you're being above competition. Even envy, one of the most uncomfortable emotions to admit, carries hidden value. Envy is like a compass pointing to what you secretly desire but haven't owned yet. If you feel jealousy when someone else publishes a book or launches a business, that emotion is illuminating the direction of your own aspirations. Ignoring it keeps you spinning in quiet frustration, but acknowledging it can clarify what you really want to pursue. The point is simple. By repressing shadow traits, you waste energy holding them down. By integrating them, you access an underutilized source of drive. Productivity stops being a tug-of-war with yourself. Instead, the traits you once buried become collaborators that give you more to work with. So how do you start working with your shadow in a practical way? Remember, this isn't about letting impulses run wild. It's about reframing them as potential energy and deciding how to direct them. And you don't need hours of self-exploration to begin. Here's a short exercise called shadow mapping by inversion that takes just a couple minutes. Step 1, pick one strength you're proud of. Let's say persistence. Step 2. Write down the side effects or darker qualities persistence might carry, maybe stubbornness, rigidity, or workaholism. Step 3. Look for the hidden potential in those traits. Stubbornness, for example, when acknowledged, can translate into resilience. Rigidity might signal the ability to set standards. Even what seems negative often hides usable energy if you learn to redirect it. This small exercise makes your shadow less abstract by showing how different sides of the same quality coexist. You don't need to fix or banish these traits. You just need to recognize where they belong in your toolbox. A quick word of caution. Exploring your shadow can sometimes bring up harder material than expected. If experiences feel heavy or overwhelming, working with a coach or therapist can provide support. Consider this exercise a light, exploratory entry point, not a substitute for deeper work. Once you begin integrating shadow traits, you'll often find procrastination eases without force. That's because you're no longer draining energy to suppress a part of yourself. You're redirecting that energy into action. Burnout also softens because you aren't locked in a daily battle to deny your own impulses. Instead of dragging yourself to the desk, you feel more aligned, with both your acknowledged strengths and hidden drives working toward the same goals. Think about how much time and money people spend chasing productivity tools, apps, planners, motivational speeches, hoping they'll add energy. Most of these only reorganize what's already there. But your shadow is like a reserve tank you've carried all along. By refusing to acknowledge it, you leave that fuel untapped. By integrating it, you gain access to momentum you didn't realize you had. The takeaway isn't that the shadow solves everything or that it's the sole key to productivity. It's simply a reminder that a major source of energy is already inside you, but currently misdirected. Suppressing those drives causes friction, while integrating them allows you to reclaim focus and persistence. Productivity becomes less about fighting yourself and more about collecting all your traits and pointing them in one direction. The more you stop seeing your shadow as an enemy and start treating it as raw material, the less resistance you feel each day. Rather than splitting yourself in half, you're unifying the energy that was always there. Reframed this way, the traits you wanted to hide become the very ones propelling you forward. But even with those internal resources aligned, there's another obstacle that subtly drains progress: your brain's instinctive reaction to change itself. Because as soon as you try to build something new, another part of your wiring flips on, a system designed to treat unfamiliar situations as potential threats. And that's where the next challenge begins. Why your brain mistakes change for danger. Why does your body sometimes panic when all you're doing is trying something new? You plan a workout, sit down to start a project, or decide to adjust your routine. Logically, none of this is life-threatening. Yet your chest tightens, your pulse spikes, and a voice whispers, "This is too much." It's easy to mistake that reaction for proof you're unprepared. But what's really happening is less about the task and more about how your brain's older circuits still treat uncertainty. The human nervous system evolved in conditions where the unknown often equaled danger. For our ancestors, novelty might have meant encountering new animals, strange plants, or unknown groups, and confidence could have carried a fatal cost. To survive, the brain's threat detection system built a shortcut. When in doubt, assume risk. This wiring still runs today, even though new usually means applying for jobs or launching a side project. Neuroscience shows that the amygdala and the brain's salience network light up for both novelty and threat. They tag unfamiliar situations with an alarm, pushing you toward fight, flight, or freeze. The result is that your body can misread harmless change as though it's survival-level risk. This creates a subtle conflict. Anytime you try to expand, the old circuitry raises resistance signals. Your palms sweat before speaking in a meeting, not because your idea lacks value, but because unpredictability feels flagged as danger. Fear doesn't erase your competence, but it does reduce prefrontal regulatory capacity, which makes clarity harder right when you need it most. Because fear hijacks attention, you end up confusing "I feel unsafe" with "I must not be able to do this." The pattern becomes self-sealing. Nerves convince you to hesitate, and hesitation convinces you the nerves were justified. You can see the effect in everyday examples. Someone signs up for a morning run, and after one attempt, their body's alarm convinces them they're not built for it. Another person steps into leadership, but their nervous response makes them believe they lack the role's qualities. A student begins a creative or academic project, but the blank page paired with nerves makes them conclude they don't have talent. In each case, ability is not the problem. The old alarm system is. And by misinterpreting novelty as danger, progress is abandoned just when it should begin. The important reframe is this: the fear you feel is not a verdict, it's an alert system built for another environment. Anxiety at the start of change isn't evidence you're weak, it's your body running protective software from centuries ago. Once you recognize that, you stop confusing nerves with failure. The discomfort becomes expected background noise rather than a final judgment. That simple shift can release the grip of hesitation. So how do you teach the brain that not all novelty is risk? Through repeated, safe exposure. Instead of leaping straight into massive changes that overwhelm the alarm, shrink the challenge into microexperiments. These are small, 2 to 5 minute actions that let you explore something new without triggering the full flood of stress. Each experiment tells your nervous system, I did something uncertain and nothing catastrophic followed. With repetition, those signals accumulate until the brain updates its settings. The effect is striking when applied consistently. Consider public speaking. Attempting a keynote speech on day 1 overwhelms most people, but speaking up once during a small group meeting already counts as a microexperiment. The change feels new, but not overwhelming. Repeating this small step again and again lowers the alarm over time. Later, presenting in front of larger groups no longer floods the body with the same resistance, because the system has collected evidence that unpredictable settings are survivable. Progress comes not from heroics, but from repetition of small, safe exposures. This same principle applies anywhere. If you're starting a new morning routine, avoid the massive overhaul that feels suffocating. Begin with a 10-minute shift in wake-up time or one new habit added after something you already do, like stretching while coffee brews. If you want to pick up a skill, give yourself 5 minutes daily instead of waiting for an hour of motivation. Each repeat interrupts the brain's tendency to interpret novelty as danger. By stacking these low-friction wins, you quietly retrain your threat detection system to stop flooding you with unnecessary alarms. Also worth noticing how this changes the meaning of nerves. Instead of asking, why do I feel so scared? You begin asking, what small next experiment would remind my brain this is safe? That question moves the conversation inside your head from doubt into strategy. You don't need to eliminate fear completely. It's unlikely to vanish, but you do need to reframe it. When fear stops signaling stop, and instead signals, you've entered new territory. The emotions remain, but their authority weakens. Learning this distinction makes the hardest part of personal change clearer. Growth is always going to bring nerves, but fear is less a reflection of your limits than a measure of novelty. And novelty, repeated safely in small increments, becomes normal. The same alarm that once paralyzed you soon turns into a marker of areas worth pursuing. Discomfort, paradoxically, means you're exactly where growth is happening. A student advancing into tougher classes feels crushed by the first lectures. If they quit, they assume the stress was proof they weren't capable. But if they stay through repeated exposure, the brain quiets down, learning the material no longer counts as threat. Progress had less to do with intelligence and more to do with interpreting the body's warning correctly. This is how many productivity goals get derailed, not from lack of ability, but from walking away too soon in response to that ancient circuitry. See this at work in creative fields, too. Sitting in front of a blank page, many new writers feel their body tense as though they're entering unsafe territory. But writing a single sentence is often enough to nudge past the alarm. Later sentences come easier, not because talent increased, but because the brain tagged the activity as more familiar. That same principle carries across physical training, job applications, presentations. Wherever novelty is mistaken for danger, microexperiments resolve the confusion. The takeaway is straightforward. Don't wait for fear to disappear before starting. It won't. Break every new undertaking into the smallest experiment you can practice safely. Use repetition, not massive leaps. Each step trains your nervous system to accept uncertainty as manageable. You aren't trying to silence fear, you're updating what your brain does with it. Once that shift is made, fear becomes less of a barrier and more of a direction sign. The shaking voice before you speak, the spike of nerves before you launch, the unease of starting a new routine, All of these stop meaning, don't do this, and start meaning, pay attention, something new is beginning. In that sense, discomfort reliably points toward expansion. But even if discomfort no longer stops you, there's another layer that quietly shapes whether progress actually sticks, the kind of goals you aim at in the first place. Because not every goal you chase is truly yours. Some ambitions are borrowed, programmed into you by culture, family, or social feeds. And if the values behind them aren't authentic, no amount of systems or experiments will hold them up. The trap of borrowed values. Are your goals really chosen, or have they been absorbed from the expectations around you? This is the trap of borrowed values. Many people assume their ambitions come from private reflection, but identity research shows that values are often shaped early by family pressures, cultural norms, and the examples we constantly observe. Over time, those outside influences sink so deeply into our sense of self that they feel personal, even when they're not. Think back to the milestones you've aimed at. Certain careers, income brackets, or lifestyle symbols. How many of those came from your own lived desires, and how many were programmed by the models you grew up with? We inherit these priorities the way we inherit hand-me-down clothes, without asking if they fit. And like clothes that hang awkwardly on your frame, borrowed values weigh strangely on your actions. You can carry them for a while, but the mismatch shows itself when effort runs dry. The difficulty is that borrowed ambitions can perfectly mimic authenticity until the grind phase arrives. When deadlines tighten, when energy dips, or when applause fades, the gap between what you truly value and what you were taught to value becomes visible. Work rooted in second-hand priorities runs on shallow reserves. You can sprint on the external momentum for a while, but when friction increases, passion collapses because there's no deeper reservoir behind it. That's why so many projects start with fanfare, only to collapse in the quiet middle. This collapse often creates confusion. People blame themselves for lacking discipline, but the truth is simpler. No matter how streamlined your system is, it won't hold if the foundation is misaligned. Borrowed values trick you into chasing goals you don't actually care about, which is why even brilliant frameworks and perfect routines feel strangely hollow when you apply them. The system isn't broken, you're running it against the wrong target. Contrast that with authentic values, which reveal themselves not in what you say, but in how you actually spend your scarce resources, time and money. If you examine your calendar and your bank statements, you often uncover truths about what matters most. Do you spend energy learning, creating, moving, or connecting? These daily actions are stronger evidence of genuine priorities than any mission statement or vision board. By watching where your attention flows without external pressure, you see what you really value. You can also look at your emotional responses. Admiration and envy, unpleasant as they feel, can be clues. When someone else achieves something and you feel genuine admiration or even jealousy, it often signals a value you personally hold. If achievements leave you flat but you still claim you should, want them, that points to a borrowed script rather than an authentic driver. Authentic values feel alive in your nervous system, even if they scare you. Borrowed ones feel forced, no matter how polished they look on paper. Because this distinction can be slippery, here's a short 3-question audit that helps uncover whether you're working with real or borrowed values. First, what choices have I made when nobody was watching? Second, what activities leave me drained even when they look like success? Third, where did this goal come from, my lived experience or someone else's expectations? These questions may seem simple, but they peel back rationalizations and reveal whether the goals you're pursuing are grounded in personal truth or inherited scripts. Once you recognize where borrowed values are driving your routine, you can pause and redirect without moral judgment. The point isn't to cancel family traditions or rebel against culture. The guidance here is to test and choose values deliberately instead of letting them run invisible in the background. A practical way forward is to pick one goal you're currently chasing, put it on pause, and then reevaluate its authenticity. Ask whether this aim is feeding your identity or simply feeding your image. From there, run a small experiment. For 2 weeks, try a micro-action aligned with a value you know you've chosen for yourself. If creativity lights you up, commit to a short daily practice of writing or sketching. If learning excites you, set aside 5 minutes each morning for reading or listening to deep content. The experiment is less about performance and more about noticing energy. Does the action leave you tired but engaged, or hollow and strained? These experiments create direct evidence about what belongs to you. What you'll usually notice is the shift in emotional texture. Tasks aligned with borrowed values demand endless pep talks. They feel like you're forcing movement against the grain. Tasks aligned with authentic values often feel challenging, but they return more than they take. You may end the day fatigued, but the fatigue feels worthwhile, like training a muscle you actually wanted to grow. That difference is what sustains effort long after motivation's initial surge fades. Over time, this alignment becomes the anchor for sustainable productivity. No matter how clever a system looks, its longevity depends on whether it reinforces who you already are. A habit tracking app linked to borrowed values withers quickly. The same app, linked to real values, feels natural because each checkmark reinforces identity instead of clashing with it. Authenticity makes the scaffolding work for you rather than against you. Notice how this reframes common struggles. A person who can't keep a workout program for more than a week might believe they lack grit. In reality, the friction comes from adopting a fitness vision imported from peers or media, not from personal values tied to health or clarity. Another person may find it impossible to commit to a career milestone. But if that milestone was borrowed, no hack or accountability partner can keep the fire alive. What's missing isn't discipline, but genuine alignment. This frame also helps alleviate guilt. When you realize past failures often came not from weakness, but from chasing someone else's target, the shame begins to drop away. You weren't deficient, the goal was. That release creates room to test goals that actually belong to you, which in turn transforms productivity from a burden into an expression of your identity. The real pivot, then, is this: treat your values not as inherited scripts, but as choices you actively test. Use your time, attention, and money as diagnostic tools. Run short experiments that reveal how activities feel when practiced consistently. And then build systems only around the values that prove themselves in experience, not those handed to you from the outside. When you do this, productivity stops resembling a never-ending performance for approval. It becomes a toolkit for amplifying the life you want to live. The exhaustion remains. Real growth always costs energy, but it's the kind of exhaustion that leaves you satisfied. Because instead of fighting yourself, you're investing that effort into something that reflects your identity. And here's the bigger picture. Recognizing which values are truly yours is foundational, but it's not the final step. Even authentic intentions can collapse if the world around you constantly drags against them. Which means the question shifts. Once you've chosen goals that matter, what's quietly helping you move forward or holding you back without you noticing? The silent sabotage of your environment. What feels invisible yet quietly steers most of your daily actions? Your environment. And this is the silent sabotage most people overlook. You might think productivity boils down to determination or inner strength, but in practice, the cues around you decide more of your behavior than you realize. The clutter on your desk, the position of your phone, the food stored at eye level in your kitchen, all of these nudge you toward or away from certain choices without needing your conscious input. Behavioral research shows a clear pattern. Environmental cues prompt automatic choices. You rarely overeat because you planned on it. You overeat because the food was visible and within reach. You rarely waste time scrolling because you put it in your calendar. You do it because your phone lit up at the exact moment your attention wavered. Out of sight really does mean out of mind, and the opposite is just as true. What's in sight tends to get done. This is why obsessing over discipline often feels like a losing game. The environment cues the behavior before you even engage in willpower. Here's the hidden conflict. We tell ourselves failure to stick with a habit must mean we're weak. But most of the time, the bigger reason is structural. Trying to limit phone use with the charger next to your bed is stacked against you. Stocking your cabinets with chips while promising yourself you'll snack less is stacked against you. These setups are not neutral, they are tilted playing fields. Fighting them every day is like swimming against a current. You might last a little while, but eventually the setting pulls you back. The good news, design works both ways. Helpful cues reduce resistance so the intended behavior feels natural. Take a bottle of water sitting on your desk. You'll drink it even if you didn't feel especially thirsty. Walk into a clutter-free room with a single notebook open on the table. Your brain focuses more without you summoning extra effort. Place your guitar on a visible stand, and practice suddenly feels easier to start. The environment shaped the behavior, not another lecture on grit. This works because your brain defaults to conserving energy. It always seeks the path of least resistance. If the option you want takes fewer steps, the chances of doing it increase dramatically. If starting a workout requires moving a pile, digging through drawers, and finding sneakers, that friction builds hesitation. But if your shoes are waiting by the door, tiny barriers disappear. The system nudges you toward the choice before any conscious debate. Habits, in this light, are not heroic acts. They are the behaviors most smoothly enabled by your immediate environment. Take clutter as another example. Each object competes subtly for a fragment of attention. When loose papers sit on your desk, they whisper "unfinished," even while you try to focus on the document in front of you. That background drain lowers capacity. A clear desk with only the tool for your current task doesn't just look tidy, it decreases those competing signals, raising mental availability. The difference in focus is not about pushing harder, but about stripping away triggers that splinter attention. Your phone also demonstrates this principle. Notifications are novelty signals that hijack your salience network, pulling you toward whatever just appeared. The simple vibration or icon lights up seeking mode in your brain, diverting energy away from your current task whether or not you act on it. Even leaving the phone in sight has been shown to reduce focus. Put the device in another room, and suddenly the constant urge to check evaporates. The difference wasn't a new level of willpower. It was one environmental change. This is the actionable point. Cues shape defaults, and defaults quickly grow into habits. If your space is filled with cues for easy distractions, you get distraction on autopilot. Reverse them, and you make what you actually want feel inevitable. Instead of fighting temptation, restructure cues so the behavior you need carries lower friction than the alternative. And when you align that with habit stacking, placing new behaviors on top of things you already do, you make the transition effortless. So here are 3 simple environment tweaks you can try tonight. First, put your phone in another room while you're working. That one shift can save you hours of fractured focus. Second, place a water bottle on your desk so you reach for hydration instead of making snack trips. This not only reduces interruptions, but also maintains energy. Third, leave your notebook open on your desk before bed so that the next day, writing or planning starts without the friction of setup. These are not clever tricks. They're structural cues, and research shows they consistently increase follow-through. It's easy to underestimate these little adjustments because they don't feel dramatic in the moment. But environments operate through compounding. If a cue helps you save 2 minutes a day, then repeated hundreds of times, the impact dwarfs the occasional motivational push. And the reverse is also true. Spaces that introduce constant frictions bleed away hours before you notice. That's why people often feel stuck despite significant effort. They're trying to compensate for an environment that undercuts them daily. Think of your environment not as neutral, but as a hidden mechanism that sets your autopilot. Every visible cue or barrier either pushes you forward or pulls you back. Once you see that, you stop fixating on whether you have enough self-control and start asking whether the space is aligned with your intentions. Productivity shifts from an internal fight to an external design challenge. So the immediate takeaway is clear. Before pushing yourself to grind harder, examine what your surroundings are silently prompting you to do. Shift the cues, and behavior follows far more easily than trying to battle inner resistance alone. Long-term consistency doesn't come from endlessly firing yourself up each morning. It comes from structuring your space so that half the battle is already won before you even think about it. And here's the transition. Once you've set up an environment that removes friction and aligns with your goals, there's still another factor shaping follow-through, and it doesn't come from objects at all. It comes from people. Because while your surroundings trigger habits, the presence of others changes whether you actually keep your promises. Accountability, the productivity multiplier you're avoiding. Why do goals seem so slippery when they're only promises to yourself, yet suddenly solidify the moment you know someone else is involved? You sit down on Friday telling yourself you'll finish that draft, and somehow by Sunday it's still half done. But if it's a colleague or peer waiting, you're focused and delivering on time. It feels unfair, like you fail privately but flourish socially. The reason isn't mysterious. It's how your brain is built. Accountability shifts behavior by tapping into social motivation pathways. Human beings evolved in groups where your reputation and reliability determined your place. Breaking your word could mean exclusion, while contributing consistently built trust. Modern life doesn't carry those same survival stakes, but the wiring is still active. Even subtle awareness that someone else might notice your behavior connects to the brain's social reward circuits. That layer of feedback strengthens commitment more than private intentions ever do. Research on social support and peer collaboration backs this up. Studies show people persist longer and adopt habits more reliably when progress is visible to others. Reporting, even informally, to a peer group, coach, or partner boosts follow through at levels far beyond what individual motivation sustains. A private note on your to-do list is negotiable. A statement made to someone else, even in passing, transforms into social commitment. The action isn't only personal anymore. It sits inside the network your brain is wired to protect. And still, many people avoid accountability. They fear it signals dependency, that involving others diminishes their independence. But accountability isn't surrendering control, it's using an evidence-based tool. Just as changing your environment reduces friction, involving others adds momentum. Framing it as weakness overlooks that accountability is simply structured social support, one of the strongest leverage points our brains recognize. Independence doesn't mean isolation. It means choosing tools that make follow-through sustainable. Consider exercise. Decide privately to run 3 times a week, and the penalties for skipping are invisible, at worst, mild guilt. Now picture the same plan, but you've told a friend you'll meet them at the park. Missing means breaking a social expectation. The shift is immediate. The chance you show up multiplies, not from moral fiber, but because the cost of quitting moved from private to shared. Social costs feel sharper, and your brain moves mountains to avoid them. The same pattern shows up in learning. A student might ignore a solo assignment until the night before, yet never miss deadlines for a group project. The trigger isn't suddenly more discipline, it's the social frame. No one wants to disappoint peers. That quiet emotional weight pushes harder than rational planning. Productivity theories often ignore these emotions, but they carry more influence than checklists or pep talks. Even professional teams rely heavily on this principle. High-functioning groups maintain open visibility of tasks and progress. When coworkers know what you've committed to, the pressure to complete is woven into daily dynamics. Leaders don't need to micromanage because the social awareness itself sustains productivity. People want to match the expectation of reliability, and accountability structures channel that desire into actual output. One temptation for ambitious people is to keep goals secret until they're finished and polished. Perfectionism disguises this as wisdom. I'll announce it when it's ready. But in practice, secrecy shields procrastination. If nobody knows your deadline, then missing it carries no social effect. The project drifts because no bridging pressure exists. Ironically, declaring goals earlier, before things are ideal, creates exactly the spark needed to carry them across the finish line. Sharing doesn't weaken effort, it strengthens it by attaching accountability. Of course, structure still matters. Accountability amplifies, but it can't rescue unclear or misaligned goals. If you're doing something rooted in borrowed values, external eyes won't inject authenticity. What these systems do is provide scaffolding. They stabilize effort when motivation dips and help translate long-term vision into immediate progress. Accountability isn't replacement for values or clarity. It's reinforcement at the moment self-persuasion fails. So what does practical accountability look like? It doesn't require massive declarations. Start small. Tell one person a specific, measurable promise and schedule a check-in within 48 hours. This simple loop, a clear task, a defined timeline, and another set of eyes, is one of the most effective ways to translate intention into action. By narrowing the time frame, you keep momentum immediate. By tethering it socially, you make the behavior more binding. Technology makes this even simpler. Shared boards, group chats, or tiny check-in messages achieve the same neural effect. The form matters less than the awareness. Someone else knows. That knowledge activates circuits urging you to deliver, even if the person never follows up. You feel the memory of disclosure when temptation arises, and it's often enough to push you through the decision to act. Accountability can also take creative shapes. Pair up with a friend working on their own project. You don't need shared goals, just shared progress. Say, I'll send you one update Thursday night, and you send yours back. Writers often find momentum through co-writing sessions across video calls. Side hustlers gain energy from weekly buddy check-ins. These setups are casual, but the steady pattern keeps assignments real instead of hypothetical. What's interesting is how quickly you feel the shift when you try even once. The same late-night procrastination loop gets interrupted because one thought cuts in: if I don't deliver, they'll notice. That little push is often just enough to tip the balance. You still do the work, the accountability just increases the likelihood you'll actually start. Over time, a single loop strengthens your identity as someone who doesn't just plan, but completes. Accountability scales. For small goals, one partner is enough. For larger projects, peer groups compound the effect. Public progress creates a rhythm where everyone feeds on each other's updates. The group provides reinforcement on days you'd normally stall. You help them, they help you, and the shared pressure keeps all sides advancing. That dynamic is less about coercion and more about social momentum. You're letting old circuits push you forward, rather than hoping your solo drive lasts forever. The bigger point: accountability reframes productivity as a relationship problem, not just a personal one. You don't have to be superhuman. You just have to structure small, visible promises that engage the social side of your brain. That doesn't reduce your independence. If anything, it makes progress more sustainable, because you're no longer draining every bit of energy from raw will. You're aligning effort with how motivation really works. When people avoid accountability out of fear of appearing weak, they cut themselves off from one of the simplest levers available. This avoids stigma but also sabotages progress. Once you accept accountability as a tool, not a crutch, you remove resistance to using it. From that new frame, the logic becomes straightforward. Protecting secrecy slows projects, while sharing multiplies completion. Remember, you don't need a grand plan. Just pick one task, tell one person, and set a near-term check-in. Witness how that single connection shifts your odds of follow-through. And once you feel the difference, you can expand loops to bigger projects without carrying them alone. Accountability shows that lasting productivity rarely comes from sheer force. It comes from channels that convert private goals into shared realities. And once those channels are in place, the question becomes less about keeping motivation alive and more about what structures will sustain your identity through repetition. Because while accountability provides the external push, something else must create the steady daily current that cements who you're becoming. The power of tiny daily systems. Most people assume lasting change depends on big leaps, but in reality, it's the smallest daily shifts that set identity into motion. This is why tiny daily systems matter so much. They don't overwhelm you. They collect evidence, day after day, that convinces your brain you're not just trying, you are becoming. Transformation often gets framed as an all-or-nothing event. A strict diet starting Monday, a full overhaul of your morning routine, or a massive productivity system you hope will reinvent everything overnight. These can feel powerful at the start, but the intensity rarely lasts. Within 2 weeks, the excitement fades and you're back to old rhythms. The problem isn't ambition, it's scale. When efforts are too large, the brain interprets them as threats, triggering the same resistance circuits you've been fighting all along. But there's a quieter way. Small systems, actions that take 2 minutes or less, slide under the radar. They don't provoke alarms because they feel too light to threaten your energy reserves. Pouring a glass of water before coffee, jotting one sentence in an open document, doing a single stretch after brushing your teeth. These moves don't demand negotiations with yourself. They feel manageable, so you start. And starting, however small, is everything. Over time, these small acts accumulate into what psychologists call identity evidence. Each repetition becomes proof logged by your brain. I did this again, so it must be who I am. Do something rarely and it feels like a fluke. Do it daily in any form and your sense of self shifts. This isn't hypothetical. Research shows that repeated choices carve neural pathways and reinforce identity in the brain. That means change happens not when you attempt something huge, but when you demonstrate to yourself through steady actions that I am this kind of person. Take writing as an example. Waiting for motivation to create in large bursts usually means long gaps of inactivity, but writing even a single line each day turns into paragraphs, then drafts, then chapters, because the core identity forms. I'm someone who writes daily. The scale grows naturally after consistency anchors the foundation. The same applies to exercise, creativity, or learning. The identity shift comes first, the expansion follows. The tension is that simple systems look unimpressive. Committing to walk for 2 minutes doesn't sound like much compared to announcing a full fitness plan. But what sustains progress isn't short-term admiration, it's long-term momentum. Starting with a micro-habit doesn't mean you won't grow into more. It just ensures you have enough traction to stay with it until the identity cements. One of the strongest techniques is habit stacking, attaching a new, tiny action to something you already do automatically. You brew coffee, so you drink a glass of water first. You brush your teeth, so you floss one tooth. You turn on your laptop, so you type one sentence. Because the anchor is already part of your daily rhythm, the new habit connects with little resistance. Later, the single sentence grows into paragraphs, and the one tooth becomes all teeth. Expansion emerges after repetition has proved the habit belongs. These small commitments may not thrill you early on. You can't show off about flossing for 10 seconds, but you can do it every day without fail. And that consistency reshapes you in ways ambitious plans rarely sustain. This is why small systems outperform grand restarts. They don't collapse under their own weight. They persist long enough to rewire who you believe yourself to be. To make this easier, here's a simple 3-tier plan you can put into action immediately. Tier 1, a 2-minute action you can do today. Choose something invisible from the outside but powerful for identity evidence. Jog in place while tea steeps, write one sentence, or tidy one corner of your desk. Tier 2, a 5-minute extension for this week. Expand slightly. If you've been stretching for 2, stretch for 5. If you've been writing one line, aim for half a page. Nothing overwhelming, just a small build on the base. Tier 3, a short weekly reflection. Ask yourself, what identity evidence did I create this week? What felt natural? What grew harder? This reflection isn't about guilt. It's about noticing patterns and deciding if you're ready to step the action up slightly or keep it stable another week. These 3 steps build a rhythm that's both sustainable and flexible enough to expand. Think of it like compound interest. A 2-minute habit today doesn't feel significant, yet across months, the repetitions add up to hours invested, skills sharpened, and self-image redefined. More importantly, each cycle strengthens neural connections, making the behavior progressively easier. What looked at first like a trivial tweak becomes the daily proof your brain needs. The compounding works not just on time invested, but on belief about who you are. This is why many long-term changes look boring when viewed up close. There's no dramatic epiphany, no cinematic breakthrough, just small actions, repeated. After a few months, you realize you floss daily without debate. After a year, the journal you thought you'd never keep now holds dozens of entries. Over time, the overlooked micro-actions quietly become the most powerful drivers of identity. The most important lesson is to accept that big transformations don't feel big in the moment. They feel small, almost trivial. That's not a flaw, that's the design. Microsystems bypass resistance, embed identity, and accumulate into results that seem obvious in hindsight but impossible at the start. So remember this, the transformation you're waiting for won't arrive as a miracle. It will arrive in the form of ordinary gestures repeated when no one's watching. 2 minutes today builds the version of you who doesn't need miracles. And yet, even with strong systems in place, momentum doesn't always flow smoothly. Sometimes you slip back into old behaviors. It's tempting to see that as erasing all your work. But what feels like regression often points to something else, an invisible part of the process that most people misinterpret. Why relapse means you're actually upgrading. What if slipping back into old habits wasn't failure, but information? This is the overlooked reality. Relapse is data. It's your brain giving you a snapshot of the conditions where your system is still fragile. Rather than seeing relapse as collapse, the more accurate view is that it functions as a diagnostic tool. Each time you stumble, you gain a map of the contexts, triggers, and emotions that still pull harder than your new identity. Consider the last time you gained momentum, a streak of workouts, steady journaling, or consistent deep work. For a period, it felt natural. Then came the break, a skipped day, then another, maybe a week where the routine fell apart. That moment can feel like everything has been erased. But the slip is not erasure. It's evidence. It tells you precisely where your system gave way. Treating relapse this way replaces shame with curiosity, which is what keeps you learning instead of quitting. We often expect growth to look like a straight upward line. Effort leads to progress, progress leads to more effort. The reality is closer to loops and spirals. You surge forward, then regress, then climb again, slightly higher each time. From a distance, those setbacks look like interruptions. Up close, they are testing points where your brain checks whether the new habit is stable enough to hold under strain. Relapse, in that sense, is not sabotage, it's a stress test. Your old behaviors are deeply ingrained, with neural pathways formed over years. They don't vanish when you install one new habit, they remain available as default responses. This is why relapse feels so discouraging. The grooves are easy to slip back into, but their reappearance is predictable. Think of them less as signs of failure and more as indicators of where your new identity still needs reinforcement. A slip is not a verdict, it's a map. The real damage comes not from relapse itself, but from the interpretation we attach to it. Missing 2 workouts doesn't ruin your fitness. Skipping journaling 1 week doesn't erase your practice. Eating off-plan once doesn't destroy your health. What derails people is believing those slips prove they're incapable. That belief builds shame, and shame convinces you not to restart. But when you reframe relapse as diagnostic, each slip transforms into a lesson. Where exactly did my system falter? Notice how each relapse pinpoints conditions. Scrolling late at night, you find that fatigue plus phone visibility equals derailment. Losing routines during travel, you discover your systems aren't portable. Overeating in social events, the weak link is hunger combined with peer cues. Each time you fall back, the relapse highlights an environment or context where your wiring overpowered your intentions. You couldn't see those pressure points when everything was smooth. Now relapse has revealed them. When you examine relapse with this lens, growth accelerates because each slip becomes actionable. Rather than sitting in self-blame, you note, this is the trigger. How do I design around it? That curiosity drives small adjustments, environment tweaks, micro-habits, accountability signals that fortify exactly the weak spots. Progress gets built not on flawless streaks, but on systems upgraded through each recovery. This perspective matters because biological systems value stability. The brain defaults to what feels predictable and safe, even if the habit is destructive long-term. When you introduce a new pattern, the brain tests you by pulling back. It doesn't trust the new system yet. But here's the key. When you relapse and then resume, you demonstrate resilience. That cycle, disruption followed by recovery, actually strengthens the identity more than a long, unbroken streak would. A fragile streak proves nothing until it survives stress. A relapse met with recovery proves the system can bend without breaking. The analogy many people forget is learning to walk. Children fall hundreds of times, each fall integrating balance and coordination. We don't label those tumbles as failures, they're part of the program. Relapse in habits works the same way. You fall because the pattern is still stabilizing. You get up, adjust slightly, and try again. The fall provides feedback. Without it, your routines remain brittle. This is also why people who obsess over perfection often burn out. They think one broken streak means everything is lost. But when you normalize relapse, the pressure eases. Missing a workout doesn't demand abandonment, it just means you go the next day. Forgetting your journaling doesn't mean you failed as a writer, it means you restart tonight. In this frame, productivity isn't measured by perfect streaks. It's measured by how quickly you rise after a break. So instead of asking, how do I prevent all relapse? Ask, how do I recover efficiently when relapse happens? Here's a practical 3-step recovery checklist you can apply the next time you slip. First, note context and triggers. Write down where you were, what state you were in, and what story you told yourself before lapsing. Second, apply the never miss twice rule. Missing once is expected. Missing twice risks installing a new groove. Treat one break as acceptable, but stop the cascade at 2. Third, restart immediately, even with the smallest form of the habit. If you miss a full workout, do a 2-minute stretch. If you miss journaling, write 1 line. The restart reaffirms the identity quickly, preventing shame from building into inertia. To make this more tangible, here's one direct exercise you can follow after a slip. Write down the one context or emotion that led to the relapse. Then, set a countermeasure you can execute in 60 seconds or less. Finally, resume tomorrow. That's it. You're not trying to erase the slip, you're treating it as data, building the next experiment from it. Take the example of blowing off a workout because of fatigue. Step 1, note fatigue as the trigger. Step 2, Choose one countermeasure, laying out clothes by the bed or creating a 2-minute minimum workout rule for rough days. Step 3. Implement the countermeasure when the situation arises again and start back up the very next day. Each time you cycle this, the habit grows sturdier and the old groove loses dominance. The same applies to productivity tasks. Say you failed to write for a week while traveling. With the diagnostic approach, you note the trigger. Travel disrupted your environment. Countermeasure. Prepare portable cues, like keeping a notebook in your bag to capture one line each night. Then restart immediately on return, anchoring writing to an existing home routine. Instead of endless guilt, you now have a plan and proof you can continue. This mindset turns relapse into resilience training. The slip stops being a signal that growth has ended. It becomes a signpost showing where refinement is needed. Each recovery increases trust that you can continue even when imperfect. And self-trust may be the most valuable product of this process, because it ensures future disruptions won't erase identity, they'll strengthen it. Stepping back, this is the deeper shift. Real growth isn't the absence of missteps. It's learning to use missteps for feedback. Once you see relapse as expected, you waste less energy in self-blame and more energy in system design. Every slip becomes part of the architecture reinforcing your future identity. And when viewed this way, relapse isn't something to fear. It's the final confirmation that the identity shift is taking place, because you are practicing recovery, not just routine. And recovery is the mark of stability. All of this points toward one final connection. The systems you build, the identity you're shaping, the habits you reinforce, they're not separate silos. They integrate. Every relapse recovery strengthens not only your routines, but also your sense of self. And that integration is where productivity and identity begin to merge into a single track. The distance you feel from your future self isn't fixed. It's a neural pattern you can shrink. And the tools to close that gap are simple: microsystems, environment design, accountability, and even integrating shadow traits. Together, they shift daily actions into long-term identity evidence. So here's your immediate step. Write one sentence to your future self right now, or move your phone out of reach before your next task. Then, let me know in the comments which micro-experiment you're choosing. If this approach helps you see behavior differently, subscribe for more neuroscience explained practically, because small steps practiced consistently reshape who you become.